Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com, joined today by my guy, Vince Aderi, our football analyst. And Vince, we have some stuff to talk about before we dive into today's podcast topic, and that is going to be, is Notre Dame a lock? No matter what happens in the ACC title game, is Notre Dame a lock to make it to the college football playoff? We're going to have that conversation. But before we start, we've been kind of hinting about some news that's kind of coming regarding our podcast. And I want to let everybody kind of know a little bit of the backstory of what's going on. And basically is the way we've done the podcast is the podcasts have been free and we don't make any money off podcasts. And so
just for fun, we like doing it.
Yeah, we love doing it. We love engaging fans. We love providing that service. But because it was something we did for free, there was some limitations to the podcast. Number one being how frequently we could do it, because the things that we do that pay us required our number one attention, which you guys understand is, you know, Vince has a wife and kids. I have a wife and a mortgage as well. And two dogs that are very expensive, surprisingly. So those things had to take precedent. There was things we wouldn't put out on podcasts. I don't do a lot of recruiting podcasts because, you know, you don't want to put scoop out online in a free format. So I don't tweet a whole lot of information like that. Because that stuff needs to be behind some sort of paywall where we're monetizing all the hard work we're putting into doing those things. And I think people understand that. So we had really two options that we explored. Number one is we were going to make our podcast premium, which meant we would charge people to listen to the podcast,
which a lot of Notre Dame podcasts do.
Correct. That was number one. And now that was going to then mean that money was coming out of your pockets. And, we wanted to try to find a way to where that wasn't gonna happen. And so what we eventually did is we have signed a contract with Blue Wire Pods, and we're very excited about it. There's some other podcast companies that we talked to, but they weren't serious. Blue Wire Pods actually approached us, talked to us. Vince will tell you, I was a little skeptical at first, but they were phenomenal. We had multiple conversations. I had a lot of different conversations with different people. The message was consistent from them, and I got more and more excited about it. And so we have signed a deal with Blue Wire Pods. Now, what does that mean for you all? It just means you have to listen to some messages from sponsors from time to time. Essentially what Blue Wire Pods is we're partnering with them, and we put out the content and they sell advertising for the content. And so we'll have some sponsors that will sponsor our show, which means we now have a monetized podcast that doesn't cost you anything except maybe a minute to minute and a half, 2 minutes of listening to some sponsors. And I've had lots of conversations with them. We want to try to keep these sponsorships relevant to people that would be listening to a sports podcast. So, that's all part of the conversation. So we will be mixing in some advertisements. It's also going to expand our reach. We've already kind of got our podcast on some new platforms that we weren't on before. We're on Spotify now, still on iTunes. So we're very excited about that because we were able to find a way to where we could monetize our podcasts and do it in a way where it didn't cost you all money. And that
was what was really important to us is we didn't want to lose our listeners. We didn't want to lose you guys. And so essentially nothing changes for you. However you get our podcast, however it's downloaded to you, that stays the same. Nothing changes. You don't have to sign up for anything different. You don't have to go to a different, app or our company or whatever. That was really important to us because we didn't want to lose our loyal listeners. So you just keep on doing what you're doing. You keep downloading it, and everybody's happy.
Now, how it affects you also, Vince, is now we're working on a new content plan for the podcasts.
Yes.
Which means more podcasts, which means eventually we're trying to get to the point where we're having a podcast every day of the week. We're going to do some podcasts where we may do some live podcasts. We're working on that, streaming some things live. And so, and it also means that now we're not going to hold things back. So if we're doing a recruiting podcast and we have some scoop, then we're going to put it out in the podcast because now it's essentially sort of behind a paywall, so to speak.
For us, anyway. Yeah.
And so that's kind of, if there's things that we won't say on a podcast that we'll say on our website, or we'll wait for a few days before it goes out on the podcast until after our online subscribers, the people that are paying for that and the people that are frequenting our website are able to kind of absorb that information first.
Right.
Now we feel like we can do it all together. So sometimes we may put the first bit of information, that we've been able to gather on the website. Sometimes we may say, hey, Vince, let's throw a podcast together real quick about this thing that just happened, and we may give you all the information from there. So that is how it changes for you guys. So the only real change, besides having to listen to some ads and from some of our sponsors, which we are excited to partner with, it means more podcasts. It means, I think, better content in the podcast. And so we're very, very excited about that. And that's what we've been kind of hinting at, and that's what we're working on. So, again, doesn't change anything for you guys. You'll still get your podcast the same places, but it does mean that it's going to be better content and more content. So, Vince, with that in mind, our first sponsor is actually from Blue Wire Pods, who is going to talk about a podcast called American Prodigy, about Freddie Adu, the great American soccer player.
Pele leaned in and said something to Freddie.
Don't let them change you. Keep working on what makes you different and what makes you special. It was great advice, but it caused me some problems.
But what could change Freddie Adu?
Soccer is going to explode, and it's going to be around this kid.
We were the Beatles. Everywhere we went, it was the Freddie show.
And with that came the expectation, and with that came the pressure.
New episodes of American Prodigy drop Tuesdays from Blue Wire Podcasts.
So now we are back, Vince, to our topic at hand. And it's going to be sort of a two-part topic. But the main part of this, Vince, for me, is the question of, is Notre Dame a lock for the college football playoff no matter what happens in the ACC Championship game? And the premise for me is, it's hilarious to me, actually, in this era of expand the playoff. I've always said there's never been more than 5 or 6 teams a year that I felt deserved a legitimate conversation. And sometimes it's only 5. Sometimes it's 3, and you have to find a 4th team.
Yeah, right.
Which I kind of felt was true last year.
Usually from the Pac-12.
Yeah. Like last year with Oklahoma, there was such a clear gap between LSU, Ohio State, Clemson, else. And then Oklahoma and those teams. Even Alabama with Tua hurt, they were a 2-loss team that clearly weren't a playoff team. This year, it's funny because there's 4 teams that, from a talent standpoint, are better than everybody else. There's 3 teams from a talent plus resume standpoint that are significantly better than everybody else. And obviously, you remove Ohio State from that resume.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
And that's what the thing that I think a lot of people are missing. So, to me, the question that I have for you, Vince, is there anything that – well, first let's talk about what we view as criteria for what a playoff team should be.
So,
right?
Is it criteria for 2020 or is it criteria in general?
I don't think the criteria should change.
Okay.
In my opinion. Because remember, the number of games, despite what the media and other fan bases say about Notre Dame, there's not you have to play X number of games criteria, right? There never has been.
No,
so,
there's not.
So for example, for me, it's the 4 best teams. What does that mean? Right? Eye test.
Yep.
Right? That's always been a part of it.
And that's number 1 for me.
Right? Resume, I think that's part of it.
Yep.
Dominance, I think, is something. And then another thing that the committee has talked a lot about that a lot of people don't, I think, pick up on is they seem to like balance in a team.
Okay.
And that's why I don't think Oklahoma's ever gotten the love. Oklahoma's kind of backdoor their way into some playoffs where teams get knocked out and then Oklahoma jumps in.
Sure.
And because Oklahoma has lacked that balance that they've talked about, and I think that's something. So those are Vince, are there any other criteria that you see from watching the committee, listening to the committee, that you think are factor into what makes the 4 best teams for the playoff?
Well, you mentioned it. The eye test is the biggest one for me. Especially this year, because you just don't have all those cross-conference games that we usually have at the beginning of the season. And frankly, Notre Dame is a bit of a litmus test for a lot of teams that generally make it into the Final Four, because it's funny how many teams Notre Dame will play that have something to do with the teams that are in the playoff, right? Mm-hmm. So you can look at Notre Dame like, okay, well, how did so-and-so fare against Notre Dame, and how did they, so there's that A plus B equals C stuff that sometimes is fair, sometimes isn't. We don't have any of that this year. And
what you're talking about is Notre Dame, I think, is the only team that consistently plays at least 3 Power 5 opponents.
Absolutely.
I mean, three Power 5 conferences.
Correct.
Sometimes 4. I mean, we've seen years where they've played the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the ACC, and then they'll either play a Big 12 or in recent years it's been an SEC team. So that's kind of what you're talking about.
Right.
There's the Clemson versus South Carolina, and Clemson, Texas A&M. They've played Auburn. They've played Georgia playing Notre Dame, things like that. We haven't, Alabama and USC playing at the beginning of the year. We haven't seen any of that.
None of that. And I think that's why the eye test is so much more important, because some of these teams, their schedule got amazingly easier because of the conference-only schedule.
You mean like Notre Dame?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's no question about. Look,
join a conference. Okay, fine. We'll join a conference, and our schedule is going to get way easier than it would have beforehand. Yes,
there's no question about it. And so that's why I think the eye test becomes more important. And from a competition standpoint, are you taking care of business against the teams that you should beat in a manner in which you should beat them? I think that's important too.
Which actually hurt Notre Dame's early resume
because of Louisville.
Well, Louisville and then also Duke.
Yeah.
Only beating Duke by 2 touchdowns to me was like,
right.
That's changed a little bit in the last.
It totally has.
Month and a half.
It totally has.
Look at what they did at Pittsburgh. I mean, even Georgia Tech, we thought they were sloppy against Georgia Tech. That was still a convincing 18-point win. You beat Clemson in double overtime. You led almost the entire game. It was either tied or you led almost the entire game. Dominated Boston College. Dominated North Carolina by 2 touchdowns. And, it was sloppy against Syracuse. But, again, that's a 24-point victory.
Right.
Where you look at Texas A&M, they don't have that same level. They've got a couple games where they've been impressive. But for the most part, they've had a lot of ugly wins this year. So that's, to me, where that dominance level, like you talked about. Now, the question for you, Vince, is there anything that can change? So we view it Alabama number 1 right now, clearly the number 1 team in the country.
There's a
Notre Dame clearly number 2 because they do have that head-to-head with Clemson.
Correct.
Clemson number 3. We agree on that.
No doubt.
And then right now, I think Ohio State is going to be in. I have issues with that, but that's for a different podcast. Right now, Ohio State is the number 4.
A different podcast. Let me write that. A different podcast. Okay, got it.
Make a note. Number 5 is Texas A&M. 6, and this is just what the committee is ranking and our feeling of that. The number 5, Texas A&M, who is now not playing this weekend. So at best, they're going to go 8-1. And then you have number 6, Florida, and then number 7, Cincinnati, who I think has been hurt by the fact that they haven't played the last couple of weeks.
Out of sight, out of mind.
They were hot. I mean, they had just beaten Central Florida on the road. I feel like they would have had Tulsa, a ranked Tulsa team this weekend.
Are they good? Have they already canceled the championship game 2 against Tulsa?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
Okay.
No.
So they'll still have an opportunity.
But it's still questionable, you know. But you could have had 2 wins over Tulsa plus, some other things. So like you said, though, out of sight, out of mind. So I think really we're looking at 6 teams. So what can happen in your opinion, Vince? I guess kind of where do you see Notre Dame standing right now? And then we'll kind of dive into then how the ACC Championship could affect where you think Notre Dame stands now. So when you look at Notre Dame now, and you evaluate them, how do you view them as far as how they stack up against those 6-7 teams that we just talked about?
Notre Dame is clearly the number 2 team in my mind. I think Alabama is an excellent team. I think that they've proven, based on not only their record because they're undefeated, but the manner in which they're winning those games, they're the number 1 team.
They're dominating everybody.
And I have no problem with them being ahead of Notre Dame. And frankly, if the college football playoff started now, Notre Dame wouldn't have to play Alabama in the first round. Thumbs it up. That's a good thing. Okay. So I have no problem with Notre Dame being number 2. I think that there's a gap between 2 and 3 because Notre Dame beat Clemson. It's a head-to-head. That it could not be easier criteria to keep Notre Dame ahead of Clemson. They have no losses and they beat Clemson. And I have, again, you already went through it, so I don't want to rehash it. I have no problem with the order right now, just based on head-to-heads, based on resumes. Look, Ohio State is a good team. The first 3 games, I was on board with Ohio State. You could make an argument that they're the number 3 team. Once they played IU, I think it showed a lot of chinks in the Ohio State armor for me. Now, they escaped with a win, which is great.
Thanks to IU pissing away several potential scoring drives. Yes,
absolutely correct. I think IU probably should have won that game based on the way that they played, to be perfectly honest with you. If Ohio State hadn't built up that lead to begin with, I think a lot of things change, you know? And so I have no problem with the fact that Ohio State is 4 behind Clemson because of the way they played against IU. I think there's chinks in the armor on the defense. I think Clemson's a better team head to head. I have no problem with it. And now it's going to be a 6-win Big Ten tournament champion, I guess, for Ohio State.
Assuming they beat Northwestern, that powerhouse.
Yeah, well, if you're the Big Ten, they had nightmares about it being an IU Northwestern championship game, by the way. That was keeping them up at night.
Without Michael Penix.
Right, exactly. But no, I have no problem whatsoever with Notre Dame being 2, and I think they're solidly in that 2 slot. Solidly.
Now, before we move on to the next point, we have a message from one of our sponsors, Indeed. Now, 2020 has already reshaped how we work, and it's almost over. Businesses across the globe are challenged to be the most efficient, which means every hire is critical, and Indeed is here to help.
Indeed is the #1 job site in the world with more total visits than any other job site, according to ComScore. Indeed helps you find quality candidates quickly so you can focus on hiring the person you need to keep your business going.
And actually, my parents have used Indeed. And unlike other sites, Indeed gives you full control and payment flexibility over your hiring. You only pay for what you need. You can pause your account at any time, and there are no long-term contracts.
And now, Indeed's new way of matching you with candidates instantly delivers a short list of quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed match your job criteria that you can contact the moment you sponsor a job, making Indeed the only job site that can move as fast as you do.
73% of online job seekers in the U.S. are visiting Indeed each month, according to ComScore, total visits. So it's clear Indeed can get you the help and quality hire you need. That's why more than 3 million businesses worldwide use Indeed for hiring.
Right now, Indeed is offering our listeners, the irishbreakdown.com listeners, a free $75 credit to boost your job post, which means more quality candidates will see it and fast. Try Indeed with a $75 credit at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. This is their best offer available anywhere. Go right now to Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Offer valid through December 31st. Terms and conditions apply.
Now let's dive back into this conversation, Vince, because here is the question that I have for you.
Okay.
Now, the only way that Notre Dame can be a lock, obviously, for the college football playoff is if they no matter what happens in the ACC title game, they're still in.
Yeah.
So the original question is are they a lock? I think everyone assumes, rightly so, that if Notre Dame and Clemson play a similar game to what we saw on November 7th, and Clemson wins, that they're both in. The question I have for you is what happens if Clemson wins convincingly? Now, I think there's 2 scenarios. So first, we're just going to kind of dive into theoretically what changes for you if Clemson beats Notre Dame by 14 to 24 points in a game where it's not really competitive. You know, maybe it's competitive for a quarter and a half, but Clemson clearly outplays Notre Dame, beats them, similar to, the playoff game they had a couple years ago, where Notre Dame hung around for a while and then Clemson rolled.
Right.
What changes for you when you look at that and that happens?
I think the argument gets a little bit tougher, if you're trying to argue for Notre Dame. But when you put resumes side by side, let's say, so who are you looking at that number 4 spot? That's the question, right? Because
you're saying Clemson
Alabama,
and Ohio State slide up to 2 and 3 is the first thing you're saying, right?
Well, I guess I'm saying Alabama 1, Clemson 2. I would actually have a conversation about Ohio State as well, to be perfectly honest with you. I think you would put them in this bag. So I guess you're looking at who would be 3 and 4 because Ohio State will be undefeated. They'll be a conference champion. I get all of that. Mm-hmm. But if you put the resumes of Notre Dame and Ohio State side by side and you look at the competition that they played, Ohio State didn't play anybody the strength of Clemson, okay? They beat Clemson once, Notre Dame did, and they lost once, okay? Mm-hmm. Ohio State they were nowhere near that competition, okay? So I think, and they played twice as many games.
Right.
So I think if you compare those two, I would almost take Notre Dame over Ohio State right then and there. And
So
I
what
guess
you're
that would
saying
put
is-
Notre Dame at 3.
So you just would flip Clemson and Notre Dame, no matter what happens in the game, no matter how convincing a Clemson. Now, again, we are not saying that Clemson's a lock to beat Notre Dame.
No. That's not what we're saying at all.
Because it doesn't matter. This conversation's moot if Notre Dame wins.
Correct.
So the reason we're focusing on what happens if Notre Dame loses is because that's the only thing. Look, if Alabama wins and Notre Dame wins, nothing changes.
Right.
I think then we're having a different conversation. Does Clemson deserve to be in with a second loss? That would be a different.
That's a fun conversation, by the way. That's a different one, though.
So for me, whether I like it or not, no matter what, if Notre Dame loses, as long as Ohio State beats Northwestern, they're in. I don't think they should be.
Yeah, I know.
But that's again different conversation. Right. You've already.
I think they're in too. By the way, I do think they're in too. I think there's a conversation to be had about who should be 3 and who should be 4.
I think that's a fair conversation for me, but for the topic that we're discussing here is Notre Dame a lot to be in the playoff. I think you're kind of talking about seeding.
Okay, that's fair.
I think the conversation
I guess I've talked myself into the fact that yes,
so
they're a lock.
Exactly.
And I didn't really know what I was going to say going into this conversation, but when I lay out the criteria. Yes, absolutely.
Because what about Texas A&M? Look, Texas A&M has a great win over Florida. A great win over Florida.
Sure.
What's their next best win? The 31-20 at Auburn. Auburn's basically Pitt, right? They beat a bad LSU team by 13, and they looked bad doing it.
Right.
They crushed a bad South Carolina team. They had a nice win over Arkansas. Arkansas's been really competitive this year and been certainly improved, but they're 3-6.
Right. It's still Arkansas.
They beat a bad Mississippi State team and they beat a bad Vanderbilt team by 5. This hasn't been a really good team. And I know that they're ranked ahead of Florida because the committee during the regular season, the committee focuses on head to head more than they actually do when they put out the final ranking.
That's interesting.
Which is, to me, Florida's clearly a better team. You say, well, Texas A&M beat Florida. Texas A&M beat Florida at Texas A&M by a field goal way back in September or early October, right? Overall resume, to me, gives Florida the edge. So that's why, to me, I think Notre Dame is a lock for the college football playoff unless one thing could throw this whole thing out of whack. What if Florida beats Alabama?
Then you're talking about a bunch of one-loss teams.
Because Alabama's a lock. I mean, they are the ultimate lock.
They can lose to Florida. It does not matter because they're the best one-loss team out there. Correct.
Then, to me, Clemson would be a lock because they beat Notre Dame. They're a lock. Sadly, I think Ohio State's a lock if they beat Northwestern.
Yeah, you're right.
Again, we're not saying what should happen. We're saying what we think will happen because we're not on the committee.
Unfortunately.
And last I checked, I haven't received any phone calls lately from committee members asking me my opinion on the subject, which is a big mistake on their part, in my opinion.
I would love to be wine and dined by that committee. They look like they are swimming in the good stuff.
As much as I like to argue and debate, that would be a fun room to be a part of.
Gosh, it would be so much fun.
But so, I mean, again, if they beat Northwestern, they're a lock. So then the question comes down to you have one loss Notre Dame against one loss Florida. Now, the reason that makes it interesting is because Florida would then have a better win than Notre Dame has, potentially. Now, do they leap Clemson all the way up to number 1?
Right.
Because they could say, well, Clemson's only loss was at Notre Dame without Trevor Lawrence and Tyler Davis and Mike Jones and James Skalski. So Clemson was number 1 in the poll. We don't know if Clemson would have been number 1 in the committee poll because they had a loss by the time the committee came out yet, but they were number 1 in the AP and the AP poll for sure.
Yep.
So then you say, okay, so Clemson 1 or 2, Alabama 1 or 2. I think how that factors in matters because at that point in time, you could say if Clemson jumps up to 1, then Notre Dame would have the better win. But if Alabama stays 1, then Florida would have the better win. And then you look at the rest of Florida's resume. That Georgia win, unless Georgia loses to Missouri this weekend, which I predict that they will, by the way. We have that on irishbreakdown.com. We did predictions for that game.
I don't think you read mine, but I also predicted the same thing.
I know. That's 2. We were the only 2. Everybody else picked Georgia.
Of course they did.
But exactly. Don't even get me started on those guys. I'm going to have to call them all and rip them. Not really. But then they'd have that win over Georgia. And the other thing, too, is Florida's been really dominant in their wins. They beat Missouri, who I think is a good football team, by 24. They beat Georgia by 16. They beat Arkansas by 28, I believe. Beat Vandy by 21, Kentucky by 24. They played really bad against Tennessee and still won by 12. And then they're going to just destroy LSU this weekend. They're just going to absolutely obliterate LSU this weekend.
Yes, no question.
I think the only team that's packed it in more than LSU is Florida State. Would be my
fair.
thing. So I think that's why I'm hesitant to say that Notre Dame is a lock. Notre Dame is a lock if things play out the way we think that they will, which is Alabama beats Florida. Because I don't think Florida can beat Alabama. And for
I don't either.
Reasons. Number one is Florida's defense is mediocre. And Alabama's offense it's not as good as the LSU offense last year, but it's
pretty darn good.
It's in the conversation. It's in the conversation with that Oklahoma offense of 2017, in my opinion. Because when you can hang 50 on that Georgia defense, I don't care if you needed overtime or not. That's
right.
A really good offense. But the difference is Alabama's defense has played much better in the last month. I mean, their defense has really gotten a lot better in the last month. And so I don't think Florida can beat them. But if they do, I think that would make me very nervous if I was a Notre Dame fan. I am a Notre Dame fan. If I was a Notre Dame coach or Notre Dame player,
right, sure,
that would make me really nervous because Florida would have eye test. They've been very dominant. Every single win that they've had has been by double digits.
Yeah, and that win over Alabama would be
it would negate Notre Dame's Clemson win, right? So those two wins to me would kind of X each other out.
So then you got to look at the rest of the schedule.
The rest of the resume.
Yeah.
You say, their most competitive game is what? A 12-point win over Tennessee. I mean, they weren't really super impressive on defense while beating Ole Miss 51-35. So I mean, all their wins are by double digits. They have a Heisman Trophy contender. I think the thing that would help Notre Dame is what we talked about at the beginning: balance. I think Notre Dame can be viewed as a more balanced team. Notre Dame's defense is obviously their strength.
No doubt.
And it's one of the 10 best defenses in the country, depending on how they play against Clemson. I think they're top 5 right now. If Clemson, scores a lot on them, then that's going to, take a little shine off that. Notre Dame's offense, to me, is better than Florida's defense by far. You could argue Florida's offense is a little better than Notre Dame's defense. Again, we're assuming that Notre Dame loses to Clemson for the sake of this argument, and Florida beats Alabama.
With this argument, not assuming that's actually happening.
So I would say Florida's offense will be a little better than Notre Dame's defense, but then Notre Dame's offense is significantly better to me than Florida's defense. And I think that's the thing that will help them. But if you go to the eye test, Walsh.
People love offense, baby.
Yeah, and Notre Dame did have a month and a half of not playing great.
Sure.
And then you'd have the fact that when you look at Florida, you've got the better resume. I think the reality is, right or wrong, the SEC is going to have a better beating a 3-6 SEC team is going to look a lot more impressive than beating Louisville. Whether you like.
No, you're right.
Not.
I would to devil's advocate your argument, and again, we're assuming Notre Dame gets their doors blown off, and we're assuming that Florida beats Alabama.
Yes, because we both
agree
things
I do not believe
loses
will happen
by a field goal or loses an overtime to Clemson.
It's over.
They're
done.
In.
They're in. Yes, absolutely.
They're a lock.
I would say that you're right. Comparing Notre Dame's resume to Florida's resume in that scenario is not good for Notre Dame.
Right.
I would also say comparing Ohio State's resume to Notre Dame's is a check mark for Notre Dame.
Yeah.
The problem is Ohio State's undefeated. They're the Big Ten champs with 6 wins. And
that's why we both say that Notre Dame's a lock with a close loss. Because I believe, and I think we actually didn't talk about this off air, Vince, but I believe you agree with me on this, which is if Notre Dame loses close to Clemson and Florida beats Bama, the team that's going to sweat is Ohio State.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right, because I think that now they're 6-0 with no impressive wins, and now Florida's going to be at that point in time. Florida would be 10-1. Their loss was way back in the 3rd game of the year on the road to the number 5 team in the country, right? Who they would leap, because their resume would then be better than Texas A&M. And then Ohio State's resume would be what? An Indiana team that's ranked 12th to 15th?
It's the weakest schedule of anybody in the top 10.
It's not their fault. I mean, look, no one thought
I'm
Penn
not saying
State
it's
was
their
going to be this
fault.
bad.
Sure.
Michigan punked out of that game. I don't care what anybody says.
Michigan State's not good.
No, they don't play Iowa. They don't play Minnesota.
Right.
They don't play Wisconsin. And Minnesota.
It's just a bad schedule.
It's a terrible
bad schedule. Yeah.
And really, there's no Big Ten schedule that you could put together right now that wouldn't be a bad schedule.
That's fair.
That conference is just a hot mess now.
On and off the field, but that's
another
podcast.
There you go. So I think if Notre Dame loses in a competitive game and Florida beats Bama, Ohio State should be really nervous.
I would enjoy that.
I think that's how it should be because, look, the Big Ten, this is at the end of the day, this is what it boils down to for me. I'm going to just kid this a little bit and then we'll get back on topic and end this conversation. The Big Ten tried to cancel the season.
Bingo.
And now they want to change the rules so they can play for the championship,
right.
So they could get some of this.
You made your bed. You get to sleep in it. That's how it works, man. You didn't even won
a season. So, you have 2 SEC and 2 ACC teams? Yes.
Yeah.
You know why? Because they're the only 2 conferences that really wanted to play football. If the ACC and the SEC didn't step up, the Big 12 would have had no problem bailing out. None.
Right.
None.
They're along for the ride. There's no question
exactly.
about it. Yeah, no doubt.
And the Big 10 and the Pac-12 tried to coerce other conferences not to play.
Yes.
And now you want a piece of the championship game? Forget that.
Nah,
you don't deserve it. Now, Ohio State's the caveat in that Ohio State's a big reason why the Big Ten got back into playing football.
They wanted to play all along.
Right. No question. Their star quarterback could have easily opted out and gone to the NFL and done all those things. And I'll be honest with you, Vince, I gained a great deal of respect for the Ohio State program during this last several months. Because there's a lot of things they could have done that if they were like, whatever, we don't care, we're just going to go make our money, which we saw at some programs.
Sure.
Penn State, for example, was not able to kind of keep their team together. Ohio State had guys opt out when it looked like after the season was canceled.
Right.
But then when the season came back, all those guys came back.
Yeah.
John Wade came back. Wyatt Davis came back. And Justin Fields never opted out because I believe had he opted out, then there would have been you don't even have your star quarterback.
Right.
Well, so kudos to Justin Fields, Master Teague, all those players, Ryan Day. I gained a great deal of respect for Ohio State. My issue with Ohio State is more about the league that they're in.
Correct.
Than it is about them specifically.
I agree.
And I don't think that league deserves to be punished, in my opinion, for what they tried to do. And I think that's the overreaction that Jack Swarbrick was talking about in his press conference the other day. I believe he didn't say who it was, but I believe he was talking about the decisions by the Big Ten.
Yeah.
They rushed into the decision.
They did.
With, I believe, bad science and bad motives. And then when they were called on it, they kind of got backed into a corner and they were allowed to play. But anyway, back to this conversation. So I think if Florida beats Alabama and then Notre Dame loses in a really back and forth tough battle with Clemson, I think Ohio State could be the team that gets bumped out. Because I do believe, to your view, Vince, I believe in the committee's eyes that there's a big difference between 1, 2, 3, and then 4.
I agree.
And
then there's another one between 4 and 5, honestly. But that's
I don't think Texas A&M, to me, is in this conversation.
And they shouldn't be. They're above Florida because they beat Florida in the regular season. I get that, but you're right. I don't think that's the way it's going to end up.
No,
well, it might end up that way because Florida's going to have 2 losses.
We're talking about if Florida beats Alabama, but correct. And so I think this is really a 5-team conversation. And that's part of the reason it's kind of going to be hard to leave Ohio State out, because if Texas A&M goes and plays this weekend, well, they're not playing this weekend. Their game against Ole Miss is canceled. If they play Tennessee next weekend, they're 8-1. That's 9 games. Is that really a whole lot different than the 6 that Ohio State played?
Not yet.
And their schedule would be pretty soft too, outside of the win over Florida, and then they got curb stomped by Alabama.
Right.
So I think that would kind of be like hey, they only played, they got 2 more wins than we have. It would be the Ohio State argument, and we dominated the teams we played. Where they've kind of looked bad doing it. So anyway, that's my stance. So, I think before we wrap it up, we got one more note from our sponsor for you.
Football is back in full swing. You might not be at a game this year, but you can still be in on the action at BetOnline. BetOnline is going the extra mile to make sure you get in on every possible chance to win this season. From game spreads and totals to team, player, and coaching props, BetOnline gives you more options to wager than anywhere else. You can get in on their season opening bonuses today and start off wagering on wins, division, and championship futures all day, every day. Head to BetOnline today and take advantage of all the great sign-up bonuses. Don't forget to use the promo code BLUEWIRE at betonline.ag. That's Blue Wire, all one word. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts.
All right, so let's kind of wrap it up with Vince. So we think Notre Dame, or Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson right now 3 are all either locks or close to locks.
About as close as you can be.
They're all locks with wins. They're all guaranteed locks with wins.
No doubt. Now, all 3 of those can't win,
Correct.
Obviously.
Notre Dame is a lock, 100% lock if they lose in a close game, correct?
Yep. Touchdown or less.
I even think it could be 10
points.
but it's competitive.
Yeah.
Like Notre Dame's down 3, they go for it on 4th down with 2 minutes left. Clemson goes down. Right. It's about how the 60 minutes go.
And again, it's the eye test, right? It's what are we seeing, right? Yeah.
Right. So, and I think they're a lock, even with a blowout loss to Clemson, they're a lock if Alabama
beats Florida. Yeah, absolutely
right?
Agree. So we have to be Alabama fans next week.
Yes. I know that hurts. That it just kind of makes you just want to kind of, your lunch a little bit saying that, but it's true. I mean, it's true. And I would say you should be a Northwestern fan, but let's be realistic. Let's just keep this honest. And, Florida has a chance to beat Alabama with slim one. Northwestern has zero chance of beating Ohio State.
Zero.
And I would have rooted for Northwestern had I not encountered their fans a couple before the Michigan State game. They were on Twitter. They were like, wow, you guys have fans? First of all, is my question. I didn't realize Northwestern had fans. And I didn't realize kind of how
they're all in the media.
They wanted to puff their chests out like you guys did something. And then, of course, 2 days later, they go out and get beat by Michigan State, who's terrible. So I just thought that was kind of ironic. So I'm not rooting for Northwestern ever again at anything. You need to root for obviously if Notre Dame wins, it's no big deal. But I think that rooting for, and honestly, I still think Notre Dame fans, if Notre Dame wins, right, because the SEC Championship game is later. If Notre Dame wins, Notre Dame fans should be rooting like crazy, in my opinion, for if Notre Dame wins in a close game, then I think Notre Dame fans should be rooting for Florida.
Yeah.
Yes. Because then I think you'd be in a scenario where either Clemson gets bumped out or because I think Clemson gets bumped out. Then you're in a scenario where Notre Dame would be matched up against Ohio State or Florida in the first round, potentially Florida. So I think there's even a scenario where Clemson stays in, but yeah, I think because it'd be, I don't know, just kind of get the number 1 seed, and then get Florida in round 1, and then Ohio State and Alabama kind of have to beat each other up in the semifinals is kind of where I look at it. And because I think Florida would be a fun game for Notre Dame. I think I've always kind of wanted a shot at the Gators. And this would be an interesting, because I think Notre Dame, we proved against North Carolina, they can play with a team like that. And I think with Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah and Kyle Hamilton, you have 2 athletes that can kind of run with Kyle Pitts, which most teams don't have. So that would be a game I'd like to see. But if Notre Dame loses, then roll Tide.
93 Sugar Bowl, right? 93 right. Sugar Bowl?
It was 92.
Yeah, 92? Yeah, all right. I just remember Bettis scoring a touchdown, doing the Gator chomp.
Classic. It was after the 91 season, but it was a 92 Sugar Bowl.
White jerseys, green numbers,
Yeah.
That
ground game got rolling in the second half. But
beautiful.
So I mean, that's kind of how we'll wrap it up. So I think that if Notre Dame loses to Clemson, it's roll Tide all the way.
If they win, it's go Gators.
It's go Gators, unless you actually want to play Ohio State in the first round. And I think a lot of Notre Dame fans do. Notre Dame, I
wouldn't have a problem with that.
I wouldn't have a problem with it either. So I mean, as long as they win, then the options are going to be either Ohio State or Florida, depending on who they play. I don't see any scenario where they leave Clemson at 3.
I don't want Alabama. That's all.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
Well, you're gonna
no
if Notre
Bama.
Dame's gonna win the title, they're gonna have to get Bam at some point.
That's fine. That's
know,
fine. I just
get
don't want
them
them in
in
the first
round
round. I want Notre Dame to win a semi. And
I got you.
Let's take that next
step.
step.
And I think if they win a semi, I think they'll have enough confidence to go compete with Alabama.
Nailed it.
Anyway, so that is it. So we're gonna have a couple other podcasts coming up here real quick. We're gonna have a conversation about Clark Lee and Vanderbilt.
Correct.
Going to give you the latest of what I'm hearing regarding Clark Lee and Alabama, and then we're going to kind of talk about some pros and cons as to why Clark Lee would consider this. I see a lot of people saying, "Well, why would he do that? It's a terrible job and it's a bad football program." I get that, and I agree, but I think there's a much more holistic view to this. So I do think a pros and cons conversation needs to be had, and then of course we'll give you the latest of what's going on. And also next week on Wednesday, signing day. So we're going to have several podcasts breaking down the 2021 recruiting class. We're going to dive into some stuff. We're going to kind of give some scoop on things we've heard, and of course give analysis on the players they signed. And then of course next week we'll also have a couple of Clemson podcasts. So make sure you be on the lookout for that. We have a lot of podcasts in store moving forward here, and we're excited to have you with us. And we thank you all for being a part of this. Look, the reason that we are even able to have a conversation with a company like Blue Wire Pods. And if you go look at their, I mean, they've got former NFL players that are doing podcasts with them, former Division I basketball players doing podcasts with them. So we're really excited about it. We spent about a month, Vince and I, kind of doing research on them and really seeing if this is something we wanted to do. And we're excited to partner with them. But the reason that they even had a desire to partner with us and come join us is because of y'all, because the numbers that we're having when it comes to downloads and viewerships and all those kind of things. And so, you guys helped to make this happen. And that's why we, if at all possible, unless there was no options, we wanted to avoid the route where, we then say, hey, thanks for being loyal listeners. And by the way, here's the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's your monthly fee to continue listening. It's because of y'all that we were able to do that. And continue making this a free podcast.
This Clark Lee podcast that we're going to do is going to have some inside information, stuff that we're hearing, right? That normally we wouldn't put out on a podcast.
Yeah,
we would put it behind the paywall on the website, et cetera. So we're already throwing information that we wouldn't normally do. Yeah. So that's just one.
And that's what we're going to do. I mean, and that's again, that's because of y'all, because of the viewership, because of the listenership. Because the fact you guys have been so loyal and we've really grown. I mean, the last month our numbers just skyrocketed in podcast downloads, and it's been like that for the website as well. So we're truly grateful to have you all with us, and we're very excited about this moving forward. Very excited. There may be some clunky lead-ins to ads because we're getting used to. Well, I'm more getting used to this. Vince does this on the radio all the time, but I'm getting used to that because you guys all know me. When I get to talking, the script is off. The script is out the window. So anyway, but thank you all for being with us. Thank you all for helping us grow. I asked you guys a year ago when we first launched this thing, hey, if we're going to grow, we need y'all, and you guys have been with us, and we're excited about that. We're thankful for that, and we're just looking forward to continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. So for Vince D'Addario, I'm Brian Driscoll. Have a great weekend. Enjoy your college football this weekend. You can watch a lot of other games since Notre Dame's not playing. I'll have an article out tomorrow kind of saying the games that I'm looking for, the games that I'm watching. There's not going to be a ton that have a lot of direct impact on Notre Dame. That's going to be more next weekend, and so we'll have a lot going on. I'm going to be a big Tennessee fan next weekend because if Tennessee beats Texas A&M and Alabama beats Florida, I don't care what happens in the ACC title game. Matter. Notre Dame is getting in the college football playoff. So we'll have a lot of stuff on that. So anyway, have a great weekend, and we will talk to you all again very soon.